Guys, let's set the record straight on this 100% property tax. So we first heard about this in January 2025 as part of a group of measures aimed at tackling the housing crisis in Spain, and it garnered a lot of attention both from media outlets in Spain as well as international media outlets as well. Things then went quiet for a little while, but it is now back on everybody's radar again after an official proposal was drawn up in May with the idea of charging 100% tax on property purchases by foreigners made in Spain. So naturally, a lot of people will be wondering what it means for them. Is it going to impact their ability to buy property in Spain? Is it going to completely destroy their dream of perhaps moving to Spain and relocating there? Well, in this video, I'm going to walk you through what is currently in the proposal, what it means for you in terms of financial implications, and at the same time, answer the question, should you be worried about this or not? And spoiler alert, the answer is probably not. Let's get right into it. If you're new here, my name's Jonny. I'm originally from the UK, but I've been living and working in Madrid for the past 5.5 years. On this channel, I talk a lot about life in Spain, particularly the financial aspect of living here when it comes to property, banking, investing, and I also share a lot of my travels around the world. So let's start with a bit of context of the costs associated when buying a property in Spain. You're typically looking at around 10 to 14% of the value of the property when you purchase it, with the majority of that total cost being made up of one of two purchase taxes that essentially exist right now. One of them being VAT, known as IVA in Spanish, and the second one known by the initials ITP in Spanish, which means Impuesto sobre Transmisiones Patrimoniales. Essentially, for any second-hand property purchases, this is what will apply. The current rates in vigor at the time of doing this video are 10% for VAT transactions and anywhere between 6 and 11-ish% on ITP, because the second-hand property transfer tax is essentially regulated by each autonomous community in Spain, which determines their own percentage. So you have autonomous communities like Madrid, for example, down at the lower end at 6%, and you've got autonomous communities like Catalonia or the Valencian region where you could be paying 10 or 11% on second-hand property purchases. And so according to information published by Spanish media outlet El Economista, it would essentially work as a top-up in addition to the base transfer tax that would be applied by an autonomous community. So let me take you over to Excel right now to give you a quick example of how this might work in practice. All right, so let's assume that I want to buy a property in Spain and I am a foreign national and I would be in theory subject to this 100% tax. How would it work? So my property purchase price is 300,000 euros. We're going to say that it's in the autonomous community of Madrid and it's a second-hand property. So in my case, the transfer tax, the ITP, is the one which is applicable, which you see here is 6%. So on that 6%, that means that my purchase tax owed before this top-up would be 18,000 euros. And so my total purchase costs would be round about 20,000 euros in total. Now, as I say, we need to consider that top up. So I'm going to manually input something here. I'm going to put in plus 94%, which is essentially what would be added on. So I've now got a 100% tax, which is that 6% from Madrid and 94% from the central government as the top up. So you can now see that my total purchase tax is 300,000 euros, the value of the property essentially, and I've also still got my other purchase costs as well. So my total purchase costs are actually greater than the value of the property I'm buying here in this hypothetical scenario. So you can see from that example, on a 300,000 euro property, with the purchase costs being slightly higher than the value of the property, 302,000 euros as we saw, the total cost for you to purchase that property would be about 602,000 euros under the new proposed law. By the way, if you're thinking about buying a property in Spain, you'd like to have a clearer picture of how much it's going to cost you, both in terms of purchase costs and what kind of mortgage conditions you're looking at, then you can download that Excel file that I presented there. It is my property purchase calculator. You can download it either from the Millennials of Money website or you can download it from the store here on YouTube as well. You can put in your own numbers, select from a range of different autonomous communities and adjust your other purchase costs based on information that you have from lawyers or estate agents directly in order to get the most accurate purchase cost that you're looking at paying when you acquire a property in Spain. At the time of recording, it doesn't take into account the top up that would be applied on foreign purchases. But should this come to pass, then the calculator will be updated and will reflect it. And if this does become law, then you'll see in the pinned comments that calculator has been updated to reflect it. And so in saying that last point, I've given away a little bit of what I'm about to talk about now in this next section, which is all about, should you really worry about this 100% property purchase tax? Before we go through the answer, let's go through the facts and the information that is available right now as to whether this is something that you should potentially worry about or not. First of all, let's start with the point I just gave away, is that it is not yet law. At the time of recording, it is still nevertheless a proposal. By the sounds of things, this will go through the Spanish Parliament, but the current government requires on the support of a lot of smaller parties, and not all of these parties necessarily will support this bill for it to be able to pass through. So many people think for that reason that it's very unlikely that this will actually become law, at the very least in the current form that it's been drafted. Now let's take the very hypothetical scenario that this does become law. Who will it affect? Because a lot of the media in their headlines have not given the full story unless you've gone in and actually read the articles. And even myself, up to this point in the video, I haven't told you exactly which foreigners would have to pay this tax were it to become law. And so there's really two key criteria that someone would have to meet for them to have to pay this tax. They would have to be, number one, a non-EU national. That's to say they're not a national of an EU or EEA member state. The second criteria is that they are non-resident. That's to say they don't have a habitual residency established in Spain, whether permanent or temporary. And so both of those criteria would essentially have to be met for this tax to be applicable in a person's case. So that's to say that a resident EU national would not be subject to it. A non-resident EU national would not be subject to it, nor would a resident non-EU national be subject to this tax. And with that, let me bring in some data from Idealista from 2024 regarding property purchases in Spain by foreigners. So according to Idealista, in 2024, there were a total of 637,000 property purchases in all of Spain, covering both Spanish and foreign nationals. Within that total, 93,000 properties were purchased by foreign nationals in Spain. As you can see in the table, there are EU nationals in there, there are Germans, there are French, Italian, Dutch buyers, Romanians, and others. If we look at the data for non-EU nationals purchasing those properties, we have 8,000 purchases by British nationals. We have 5,000 purchases by Moroccan nationals, 3,000 purchases by Chinese nationals, 3,000 purchases by Ukrainian nationals, 2,000 purchases by Russian nationals, and 1,500 by US nationals. So summing all those nationalities together, that comes to about 23,000 purchases by non-EU nationals out of a total of 637,000, which is about 3.6% of those purchases represented by non-EU nationals. And you know, within that 23,000, I don't have the statistics on hand to back this up, but I would imagine that there's a good number that are residents in Spain. So that means that that number of non-EU, non-resident purchases is even lower than that. You know, probably you're looking at between 15 to 20K at very most that are being made by non-EU, non-residents when it comes to property purchases. So in the grand scheme of things, looking at that data, like, it's very statistically insignificant, the number of people that this would potentially impact when it comes to people who may have to pay a top up to pay 100% property purchase tax when it comes to buying property in Spain. But on top of that as well, if someone is a non-EU, non-resident and they do want to buy a property in Spain and not have to pay this purchase tax, probably the best way around that is to acquire residency in Spain. The Spanish Golden Visa was officially scrapped this year, which allowed you to purchase property and become resident in Spain. But there are other visa options available, such as the non-lucrative visa, where if you have savings or passive income that can sustain you whilst you're living in Spain when you meet the financial requirements, that is a way to acquire residency in Spain. Once you've acquired residency in Spain, you could then go ahead and purchase your property and not be subject to this 100% tax. Equally though, for this group of people, I guess it's less likely that they will be looking to purchase property, but you've also got the likes of the digital nomad visa. That is another visa route for non-EU nationals to become resident in Spain. Granted, if you go down one of those visa routes, you may have to adjust your budget for what you're looking for, or the criteria that you're looking for in a property, because probably some of that budget for the house, you may need to use it as proof of financial means and to sustain your living costs whilst in Spain. And if you think a non-lucrative visa or a digital nomad visa is something that you would be interested in and you're looking for legal support with your application, be sure to check out my partner Bureaucracy, link in the description, and you'll get a 10% discount on your visa application going through them. But in addition to all of that, the Registro de Economistas Asesores Fiscales, the REAF, which is a body in Spain, reported in El País that there are a number of grey areas or perhaps legal loopholes with the current legislation that mean that certain transactions wouldn't necessarily be subject to that 100% tax. The first one being properties that are purchased directly from a real estate developer. Typically think like new builds, off plan, those kind of things. The reason being is that with these new build properties, it's not the transfer tax that's applicable because it's not a second-hand property, it is VAT at 10%. And what one of the lawyers said is that VAT should essentially be harmonized, and as a result, it technically shouldn't be possible to add further taxes on top of that VAT sales tax that's applicable on the purchase of new properties. The other legal grey area that was mentioned was regarding B2B property sales, essentially where a business is selling a property, a Spanish business, for example, is selling a property to a company, a legal entity that's registered outside of Spain. The reason being here, because even though it's a new property and so in theory VAT should be applicable, essentially transactions between EU and non-EU businesses are VAT exempt. And as a result, the selling business in theory wouldn't apply VAT on the purchase invoice, and the foreign buyer as a result wouldn't be subject to pay it. As I say, this is very much a legal grey area, as it says in the El País article, which I'll link in the description for those who want to read it. And so as a result, it does remain to be seen what will happen with this legislation going forward, whether it will go forward in its current form, whether any changes will be made, whether some of these loopholes could potentially be closed. But if we look at everything that's been said in this video up to now, with all the information that's available with the draft in its current form, we can essentially conclude that the only people who are really impacted by this on a major level are the non-EU, non-resident individuals who would most likely be looking to buy a holiday home and have their main residence outside of Spain, or they're looking to buy it as an investment property and rent it out, in which case, such a tax would probably make it significantly unprofitable to the point where, they don't want to invest in it. And equally, if you had to pay 100% tax on the purchase of a property that you're only going to be in a few weeks, a few months of the year, it's probably very dissuasive from going ahead with such a purchase. But again, taking all that info and extrapolating a little bit from the data that's available, the number of people out of the total that will be looking to buy property in Spain is pretty statistically insignificant, I would say. That's why I think at least the majority of people shouldn't be too concerned about how this purchase tax would impact them. Because in the majority of cases, even if it were to come to pass, it's probably not going to impact you. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative and interesting. Leave a comment and let me know your thoughts, and I'd be curious to know if there's anyone watching who they do think they would be impacted by this tax were it to become law. And if you like this video and you want to see a bit more about property or life in Spain in general, then be sure to check out these two videos here. The next time, I'll see you on the next one, and let's get this money.